The following program showcases the opinions of poet Dan Schneider. These views are not necessarily the views of this cable network and should not be considered as such. All correspondence regarding this program should be sent to Gallery 7 at an address which will be given following the program. Vernal Equinox. Blakean spring, a joyed sun to resurrect the earth in greens, where we have traveled in acquiescence, with a bountied heaven given to moments on this earth, but within the world a more constrained breath, people afraid of weeping, especially for the lonely, and his loneliness is no different, suspended in a Midwestern room, far from the stuffy cold water New York flats, hunching over leaflets of poetry, renewed his eyes from dust, renewed his presence from consequence, renewed his voice to a new tabernacle, and in his life of repletion, his words soaking into the land like the blood of wars. These words, a shield before his naked self. And this pressured room far from the stages of smoky readings, where he stands, a pale face lit of Crane's lantern, reading from the ream of poetry he penned in a dichotomy of words graphically morose and saintly. This thin-framed youth, all flamish red hair and intellect, a human seraph. The voice sounds with a playwright's projection from a throat calloused with Queen's New York accent. This sound bewildering to Midwestern prejudicial ears. His words spelling out immortality, and immortality justified by the sacrifice those very words are subjected to. 14 lines the needle prick of the omnisonnet. Straight is the line, margin to margin, but curves into depths of reality and intellectualism come prophetic, all without apology. To the great men from the Greek Trojan social thought through FDR's Dust Bowl, without apology when love in its kindest dream form begets the brutal grind of sex, or when the gentleness of humanist touch begets the bloodletting of an artery severed. Whichever the event, no apology, calm is the reading, no sweat on the brow of New York's cherubim.
Rise, and I rise, and I will not climb here, and I will not soar. Here I am all that shall rise and be recorded by the future. I rise past the orioles, and I rise past the choir of silences. Through the mist to my people I rise, for my people, both white and black. I rise of my people, tan and yellow, red and brown. I rise and I radiate for all things, lush, minds and bodies, men and women, children and corpses. I rise like the Lord, and I rise like the Lord. I rise like the Lord. I rise, till I clutch at my chest. You are all desire. My needs, they fall away from me. Dull flesh, can it convince itself? They are oxygen, to flame each breath, sources of food and water, to quell the instinctual ravening brought by you, sources of clothing and shelter, to protect my body from the world's duress. My needs, they fall away from me, not you, my love, for you are verging on somethingness, like the full beats of my growing heart, which falls likewise itself, in infinite crashes, into conflagrations which are only all that keeps my sonetry in this small purview, which falls from me to you. Should you inquire, you are not a need, you are all desire. This one too. Then here, and we'll have to get into him some other time when we do a rip section. James Tate won the Pulitzer Prize. I'm going to read one of these poems of his that's absolutely horrendous. If I marked it off, I can find it real quickly. Okay, page 90 and 121. 90. Take a look at this. This is called Lewis and Clark Overheard in Conversation. Now, if this is collected poems, you can get away with that. It's the same line over and over again. This is the poetry written by the Pulitzer Prize winner in 1992. Do you got that, Dylan?
Yeah, so then we'll get us some wine and spare ribs.
Yeah.
About, what, 25 times there?
Yeah. Unbelievable. Now, like I said, if you have the complete poems or something and you're printing every piece of doggerel ever written, that's fine. This is the selected poems. This is supposed to be his greatest hits.
How did he not get the Nobel?
Well, you're gonna have to come back and we're gonna talk about him.
You were talking earlier about people not pointing fingers at the bad critics or bad poets who are the bad poets.
Well, as I named some of them, Naomi Shihab Nye, Carolyn Forche, Robert Bly, David Mura, James Tate, Robert Pinsky. These are people who have gotten fame, and for various reasons, let me just shut this off, it's getting hot. For various reasons, someone like Mura had talent, someone like Bly had even more talent. They chose the easy way out. Someone like the Naomi Shihab Nyes, they play these politically correct games, but even more so than these bad poets, or James Tate, we just filmed that poem. It has to be a joke poem, I guess. James Tate wins a Pulitzer Prize. He's horrendous. And it goes across, as I say, it doesn't matter male or female, black or white. Maya Angelou is a horror show. But, I like some of her poems. They're nice. They got nice images here or there. But she's not a good poet. Intent means nothing. It's something that I've strived many times. And if I can just put in a plug for the Uptown Poetry Group that I run, and also the list, or we can do that later.
Yeah, we can do that later.
The Uptown Poetry Group, that's one of the things that I keep trying to drum into young people's minds. And there are a lot of people around town at these Hamlin universities, Macalester, U of M. These poor kids go in there, and they're being taught by people who don't know the first thing about art. I mentioned A.R. Ammons, a poet, a while ago, and we can get into this some other time. I read a criticism of Ammons recently where they said he's the Ammons who has heavily enjambed poetry. Well, unless you're writing a prose poem, every poem is heavily enjambed. Enjambment is the breaking of poetry into lines. Simple. You cannot be an unheavily enjambed poet unless you're writing prose poem. So, what my point is, critics are even worse, and the publishers are even worse than the bad poets. I have railed in the past, and I will now. Groups like SASC and the Loft, they don't do a good service to literature. They are fine as literary YMCAs. I mean, I think it's better to write doggerel than to shoot dope in your veins, but there comes a point when these people, and I've met dozens, if not hundreds over the years, and including the West Side Y in New York that run these programs, people pay $50, $100 for a 2 or 3 or 6 week class, and they think in 6 weeks I'll be Emily Dickinson, and it doesn't work like that. You have to work and you have to work and you have to keep working and keep pushing. No artist ever became great just by talent alone. And even worse and even more pervasive, obviously, are the MFA programs at colleges. You can single out the 92nd Street Y in New York, or the Loft, or SASC, and those are things you don't have to go to. But if you're into a liberal arts program, or going for your MFA, you almost have to take these classes. And how can you learn from someone who doesn't understand basic poetry? I recently, in April, went to a class at the St. Paul Library run by this woman, Patricia Kirkpatrick, who is the wife of the guy who runs the Hungry Mind Review. And I remember she read, we were reading many poems, and I'll just give one example, Ginsberg's famous poem, Supermarket in California, which is a highly erotic and highly humorous poem. Basically, it's about Ginsberg wanting to bugger the good, great poet. And she's reading the poem as if there's some great high meaning, ecstasy. Notice, and there was this heavy-set older woman in her 70s sitting across from me, and I had just finished reading the poem, and then the woman, this Patricia Kirkpatrick, was reading the poetry, and she read the poem in this sanctimonious way. I read it pretty much straight, and this woman was laughing at my reading because it's a very funny, humorous poem, and that's one of Ginsberg's great talents in his youth, was he was a great humorist. And the old lady looked at me and said, "What poem is she reading?" Because this woman obviously didn't get it. And I went up to this Kirkpatrick lady once, and I had mentioned this fellow, William Matthews, who's a now dead poet, a typical Academy poet, who I went to this writers forum in 1987, or 88, 87, and I remember, I wasn't a good poet then, but I remember I had this poem called Desert Meanderings, and I talked about the dryness, the aridity of the desert, the overwhelming heat, etc. And this Matthews fellow went to me, "Have you ever been to the desert?" I said, "No." And he said, "Well, the desert isn't like that." I said, "So? My desert is." And he didn't get the disjunction there that my poetry is my take on the world. I don't have to go to the Eiffel Tower to write a poem about the Eiffel Tower. And so I related this story to this Kirkpatrick woman, and she sort of smiled bemusedly. She didn't get it either. That poetry is about creation. It's not about truth-telling. You know, there's a book here, and
well, all experience is subjective. You and
Right.
I can have the same experience and write something completely different that contradicts each other. You know.
This woman, June Jordan, a black female poet, has a terrible book out where she gives 3 definitions of poetry, and definition number 1 is poetry is truth. That's a lie. Poetry is not about truth. Art is about artifice. That's where it comes from. Art, to tell, to make stories. I mean, poetry is not about truth. It can be about truth. You know, poetry can be, you know, there's the old saw that people put, you know, all poetry is political. Yeah, well, all poetry is about poodles or not. I mean, you can define anything in relation to one single thing in the universe. It doesn't have to be. That's the point. Not Sisyphus. I am not sure why I'm here at all. Perhaps as a punishment for my sins? But I have to do nothing save sit here and watch the old ghost in his hopeless task. Occasionally he smiles at me, and I used to return such demeanor, till some nymph filled me in on all the fuss, how he tricked many gods of his great gall and guile, deceiving even death's grin a while. He flouted them with no fear, but all fails he did. Now only I bask, watching the old fool, sipping my iced tea, grinning with glee. Then am clutched to my core by weeping for the stone, not Sisyphus. Here's an interesting rejection letter that I got that I said I wanted to show Dylan. It's from the Higginsville Reader. I believe it's in Indiana. Three Bridges, New Jersey. Okay, I'm wrong. Daniel Schneider. Dear Mr. Schneider, thank you for letting us read your work. We found none in the group we would wish to publish. Overall, Frank and I find your work needs considerable tightening and more clear images. I hope this critique helps you, should you decide to rework any of the enclosed poems. And I wrote here, it's a hilarious rejection. I sent them a poem called Archipel, Ode on the Things Themselves, a sonnet called American Babel, which is about John Henry, and then The Ring and the Painter. So there's a couple of those poems that I consider great poems. And what's interesting is when you get these rejection letters sometimes, you know, your work needs considerable tightening and clear images. So often you get these people who they'll say, if you know, in the Poets and Writers or Poets Market, they'll say they want work with clear defined images, i.e., when they say tightening, what they really mean is don't put big words in there. Give us simple words. You know, talk about bleeding hearts and talk about simple things like, you know, and this gets back to this Rena Espelot. I remember Rena, she's a nice woman. I remember one time this poetry group about 10, 12 years ago, and I still remember her comment one time. She said to me, why don't you write poems about the Verrazano Narrows Bridge or the Brooklyn Bridge glittering like diamonds in the night? And I said, and I just thought about that, and I was nowhere near. I was not a good poet then. I had talent here and there that showed through, but why would I? That's the kind of thing that she would write. That's the kind of thing that has been written 1,000 times before, about glittering diamonds in the night, about bleeding hearts. And, you know, I'm glad that Rena got a book published, and it's not a terrible book, but it's, you know, I think I gave it a 65 out of 100, which means barely passable. But, you know, these are the kinds of things that you get. Is this another rejection letter? Oh,
to get your response on something that you yourself said earlier, you said that your poetry will certainly be around in 500 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, not to be arrogant, but yeah, I mean, I can point out a Hart Crane, I can point out a Shakespeare. You know, when you film me doing my poem, there are nuggets, there are reasons why things last, good phrases. If you look at most contemporary poetry, there's nothing memorable. Everything is so about the I, the self, my experience. Every poem that I write obviously has to be about me. If I'm writing about Ed Gein, the sonnet that we just wrote, well, I just wrote, that reflects something about me. If I'm writing a poem about some beautiful girl that I'm enraptured of at the moment, that reflects me. I can't not have myself in the poem. I mean, you just think, We're little microbes on this blue little world, floating around a little cinder in one small little galaxy, one of billions in the known universe. Who knows how big the universe is beyond that, of how many potential cosmoses that there are, and all I can write about is my pain and suffering. That seems a staggering lack of imagination. I never considered myself to have a particularly good imagination in, say, the Stephen King, J.R.R. Tolkien type way, but apparently I've got a lot more imagination than most.
Do you want to briefly recount your Bly incident?
Well, the two incidents, I'll do the Moore incident first, since that happened in time. About 2 years ago, City Pages published an article by Julie Caniglia, a local writer, I assume, and it was basically "Why Art Sucks," I believe was the title of it. And so they had a forum about a month or so later at the MCAD, and the panelists were J. Otis Powell from The Loft, David Moore, Patrick Scully from Patrick's Cabaret, and 2 or 3 other people who were of no real importance. They didn't say anything and didn't do much. And basically what the whole thing, and Caniglia herself, who wrote the article, it devolved down to the notedly misogynistic David Moore attacking this Caniglia, using a lot of straw dogs and really going after her. And there was a whole bunch of lesbian feminists, and as outspoken as I am, you can pretty much tell that I'm probably not big in the lesbian feminist camp. But anyway, I had just had enough about it, and Moore, I forget exactly what he said, but he went after Caniglia in a very personal and vicious way. And so I just basically went up there and for about 5 minutes just totally destroyed him. And anyone who knows David Moore knows he's an arrogant SOB, and his face turned red and he shut up the rest of the night. And for about 6 or 7 months afterward, I had lesbians and feminists coming up to me at poetry and saying, "Hey, weren't you the guy who emasculated that Moore that night?" and patting me on the back. And it was good, because Moore is someone who is scared to take art and look it on head right in the eyes and say, "I'm coming to do something worthwhile." It's easy to say, well, I'm going to take the easy way out, and I'm going to rail against the power structure and this and that, even though as an academic, I mean, he had much more access than say, to someone like I, who, quite frankly, I couldn't give a damn if the NEA, and I hope it does go the way of the great Swifts. But anyway, so that was one of the incidents that I kind of liked, and people apparently liked. And then about a year later, and I read the poem that I wrote for this guy, Jay Leeming, who had been a regular, who came to the Uptown Poetry Group. Robert Bly was reading at this restaurant, this church in Uptown area, and he went on his usual spiel where he'd read a line of a poem and then explain it, and then read another line and explain it, and read another line. He's written doggerel, and he's got a book where a book of criticism where he really takes apart Robert Lowell. And I disagree with it. I agree with many of the premises, and he's dead on in a lot of his criticisms of Lowell. But the basic thrust of his criticism was that every so often, the young have to come and feed on the old. And so I said, after about an hour of listening to his nonsense and hearing the same fawning questions, who's your favorite poet? Why did you start writing poetry? These same people, down on the knees, ready to perform fellatio on him. I just got up and basically pointed out things in his poetry, and he got all defensive. And afterwards, after about 20 minutes, he recovered, and some of the people, and it's eager to note that there was only maybe 3 or 4 people, myself included, who were under 40 at this reading. There was one person of color, a Japanese man and his white wife. There were about five, say, female people under 40, if that. So it's generally a largely dead white male crowd, and that poem that I'll read to sometime on camera for you, Dead White Males, about him and Donald Hall. So anyway, it must have been for the first time in years that someone actually challenged him, and so I did. After about 20 minutes of reading more doggerel, he recovered, and I guess he had acted so abruptly, he felt a little embarrassed, and that it wouldn't serve him well, so he asked to see me afterwards. And so afterwards I said to him, you're just like the next Joe DiMaggio. He didn't know what I was talking about. I said, the next Joe DiMaggio, whenever a baseball player comes up or is good, they'd say he's the next Joe DiMaggio, he's the next Willie Mays, he's the next this. And I said, you're one of these guys who had the potential to be a great one, but you got the kudos too early, and you decided to coast. Much like these people, like a W.S. Merwin, who got fame early, then he got the grants to translate a bunch of mediocre poets from other languages, and you get into this system. That's why avoid poetry that has anything to do with direct monetary remuneration from the government or from any other art. And Dylan, we're planning to do hopefully a show with some young artists around town, poets and other people, and I'm excited about that because one of the things I want to do is show why these young people can think, I don't want these people to become a David Moore. I don't want these people to become a Robert Bly. There's a young woman that I met when I first met Moore in person at the Walker, a woman named Laura Winton, and I didn't think much of her poetry. About 2.5 years ago I met her, and yet she's a prototypical example, she and this other young woman named Esther Perry, of people who may never be great poets, but I have seen marked improvement in their writing because they have worked and worked and worked and developed skill. You can have talent, but I've met a lot of people. There are people I think who have as much talent as I do or more. I don't think by any stretch that I'm the most talented writer that's ever come along the block, but I know of no one who works harder. And both of these two young women who, quite frankly, don't have the talent that I do, have become good, solid poets and can be good poets in the future if they keep working. And there are people, and we can get into this at another time, that I know had much more talent, and some even more talent than I do, who just putzed. And that's a Yiddish word, to putz around, to do nothing, and just went to waste. And they are the future Blys, and they are the future Moores, and hopefully these young people that we're going to do a show on won't be that way. Here's the infamous July-August 1996 American Poetry Review. Those of you who don't know, this is the biggest selling poetry journal magazine in the country and probably even in the world. Well, maybe the Europeans value poetry more, but definitely in America. And it's basically the People magazine of poetry. Poetry, here's the poetry, most of it's doggerel. And here is the pull-out section from this issue. Doubled Flowering, from the notebooks of Araki Yasusada, translated by Tosa Motokiyu, Okuru Kyojin, and Oiji Norinaga. And here's the hand stenciled picture of the person. Apparently was a survivor of Hiroshima. Oh, politically correct people. Oh. And basically it's a bunch of doggerel. For example, here's a poem here. Iris, moon, sheath, scuba divers, chrysanthemums also, deer, inlets, dream, oars, this, earth, and onward. And I remember when this came out, I said, this guy is terrible. If this is what this person wrote, I mean, it's just because he supposedly suffered this indignity of Hiroshima. Well, it turned out the next issue, 2 months later, on page, this Araki Yasusada was the pull-out section. He was the centerfold. He was the playmate of that issue.
The meat.
The meat. Page 47, next edition, 2 months later, September, October 1996. To our readers, we regret the publication of Double Flowering from the notebooks of Araki Yasusada in our July-August issue. Neither Araki Yasusada nor the three names identified as translators are actual persons. The facts in the note introducing Araki Yasusada, as well as the portrait of Yasusada, are a hoax. All the materials came to us from Kent Johnson of Highland Community College in Freeport, Illinois, an actual person who represented himself as the close friend of the ill and incapacitated chief translator. Kent Johnson has admitted the above ruse and has claimed that the materials were written by an American poet whose name he refuses to reveal. Still, other persons may be involved, as the hoax was carried out with the aid of a post office box in Sebastopol, California, and an address in Tokyo, and an address in London, and a disconnected phone number in Springfield, Illinois, the editors of American Poetry Review. Here's the point, and it goes back to the thing in the early 1990s with those teeny bopper guys, Milli Vanilli. If you like the music, who cares where it came from? If this was good poetry, if the poetry here was good, what that should have said was, well, apparently we were suckered in. We had this brilliant poetry that came to us, but actually the source of it was not what we thought. Well, the very fact that they felt the need to publish on page 47 a retraction of the thing of publishing this says that the only criterion that mattered was that he suffered. There was no artistic judgment. And anyone who's ever read the American Poetry Review, and I've submitted a handful of times, and I've submitted poems that I'll tell you are flat-out great poems that are going to be read long after this goes to dust. The point is, there was no artistic, no poetic criterion applied to that poetry. It was published simply because of who it was, and that's wrong. It's wrong 50 years ago when dead white males only published dead white males. It's wrong when PC elitists, politically correct elitists, will only publish politically correct poetry for that. This is wrong. You know, I'm not someone who's oblivious to the political realities, and it's good to try to get people that you know who are good to you know, get greater recognition from their work. You know, I had organized that Stone Arch event. This helped you, Dylan, get this TV show. Vice versa. Hopefully someone might recognize my work, or it might get a little more publicity, or someone else, some of these young poets maybe might benefit by it. That's fine, but there has to be a standard. You should not be afraid to say, no, this is not good. This is one of the things I stressed in my poetry group, the Uptown Poetry Group. It is a critique group. It is not a support group. You can go to the Loft. You can go to the MFA program. You can go to any of these kind of functions. You'll find plenty of people who are out to make friends, who are out to heal the wounds of being sexually abused by their uncle, by being beaten by their mother, to get over their alcoholic father, etc. These are fine. I have no problem with people doing that. But what happens is, this is the end result. You get the most widely spread poetry magazine publishing crap, and you know, they publish crap regularly, but crap here with absolutely no artistic reason. And I would dare anyone, if there's anyone out here who's watching this show, whether they're in Minnesota or if someone sees a tape of this, anyone who knows the American Poetry Review, and I'll put this challenge out to the David Moores, the Robert Bly's, the Naomi Shihab-Nyes. I'll put this challenge out to the Bart Schneiders, the critics at the city pages, to anyone who wants to come on and debate the merits of poetry or art in general. Poetry is my specialty, so I'll stick with that. But regardless, if you want to tell me, you want to show me your poems, I can show you poems here, there, everywhere. And you know, as I said, I got 2 books from the Walt Whitman, from the Academy of American Poets, that we'll have to go through, I guess, another time, that I could just show you absolute doggerel, Dylan. I mean, just doggerel. That shouldn't be published. And because, I mean, there is good poetry out there. I mean, I can name.
But if your work does survive and is here for 500 years, they're going to have the Dan Schneider poetry, blah blah blah, and it's going to have doggerel under your name too. How scary is that?
You can't worry about that. But it's better than I thought I was going to do, quite frankly.